So we have Dr. Mel Langston here, the founder of MOSAC, Mothers of Sexually Abused Children, and she is going to be talking about how we can support survivors in general, how parents can support their survivors who are children, and also with a focus on service providers and how we can continue to support survivors. So with that being said, I will turn it over to Mel. Thank you so much for being here, and we're so excited to hear your presentation.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to share today. This is a topic about which I'm passionate and have a lot of almost lifelong interest in. I want to start by saying, although I'm going to be talking about, I'm the founder of MOSAC, which is Mothers of Sexually Abused Children. I also want what I say to affect the interests of fathers, grandparents, other family members, as well as teachers, professionals that work with mothers and children and families, and just anyone that has an interest. And pretty much we all should have an interest in child sexual abuse because it affects the most important members of our society, those children that are not being protected from harm when it comes to child sexual abuse. So I'll be talking a little bit about the impact on victims and mothers, as well as reporting, intervention, outcomes, trauma effects, and particularly going to focus a little bit on legal system. Actually, the prevalence of sexual abuse is much higher than most individuals want to even believe. 1 out of 4 girls and 1 out of 6 boys in the United States is actually sexually abused before the age of 18. That was a statistic that came out of the Adverse Childhood Experiences study back in 1998. However, that statistic has held through all these years. And actually, more recent research has shown that it's much nearer to 1 out of 3 and 1 out of 5. It's a difficult statistic for just normal people to actually believe that that could be happening if they start to think of the number. And right now, the number that was included in the book of the approximate number of sexual abuse survivors in the United States right now, somewhere around perhaps 60 million. The number ranges, there are different statistics, they give different numbers, but we know that there's so many, and this is so prevalent, and yet it's so misunderstood and not addressed effectively, which elongates the pain that both families and survivors experience. So we also know that most sexual abuse is not reported. So a lot of it is retrospective information that's taken, like with the Childhood Adverse Experiences study. And that we know that it results in lifelong psychological, social, and medical consequences. And that was the subject of the ACE study originally, is why do individuals that are old have medical problems that are directly correlated to childhood abuse. A very important thing that I do want to emphasize is the fact of maternal support. That was something that was well-known, well-researched way back in the early 90s when I first became involved in this field as I completed my graduate program in the early 90s, or completed closer to the mid-90s, but when I was doing my research in the early 90s, maternal support, mothers are primary support of children. They still are considered the primary supporters of children. More children are being cared for on a daily basis by mothers. And healthy, informed mothers, the best predictor of positive outcomes for victims of child sexual abuse. So it's very important for mothers to know how to address this, how to raise children who've been traumatized by sexual abuse, and how to respond to a report by a child of sexual abuse. So a page that's in the book, we just published a book early February called What Do I Do Now? A Survival Guide for Mothers of Sexually Abused Children. One of the pages actually speaks to what a mother feels like when disclosure occurs, and they're totally taken by surprise when a child comes to them and says that they've been sexually abused, or gives hints, and they ask questions and they find out that they have been. It's like a nuclear bomb explodes in the family, especially if that offender or the abuser was a family member. And most sexual abuse is perpetrated by family members, by far the largest percentage. Very few children are actually, very, very few children are sexually abused by strangers. I mean, there are community members that sexually abuse. We know about coaches, we know about teachers, we hear that on the news every day. However, the majority is by families. We don't hear that on the news every day, never have. When people ask their children about whether they've been sexually abused or when they've been touched, they teach good touch, bad touch, that kind of things. They fail to ask, for them to come and say if it's a mother that's talking to the child about if someone ever does touch you, or if you're really concerned about the way somebody's treating you, even if it's daddy, even if it's your brother, even if it's an uncle, or if it's your teacher, whoever it is, they always leave out, research has shown they leave out biological or father figures. And actually the largest majority is father figures. In my research on my dissertation, definitely it was the largest majority. So mothers will, mothers, this is the way mothers feel. They're hurting and they don't know what to do. They have questions, they don't know who to ask. They have thoughts. They wonder if maybe they're going crazy. They have feelings. They have no idea how to manage the range of feelings, everything from rage to extreme pain, to fear, to anxiety. And they have a child who desperately needs them at that point. So they have to be able to manage their own emotions as well as take care of the child and the child's emotions. It's like a horror story, and simply imagining what has happened to their child can flood a mother with horror. The imagination is unthinkable. And most mothers, at least from my research, my studies, most mothers do develop PTSD, especially if they don't have an opportunity to process their emotions, which means they're not in counseling, or they don't have people to listen to their story, listen to them, and really hear them processing their feelings, and maybe not getting to that point where they develop actual PTSD diagnosis and symptoms. So what do I do now? The book was written because it's desperately needed. There just simply wasn't a guide. When I'm a mother of sexually abused children, and when the abuse occurred, one of the questions I asked a very close friend is, give me a book. I need something that will help me know what to do next. I am clueless. I wasn't sexually abused. I didn't have any friends that were sexually abused. I did not know what to do, what steps to take, what to do next, how to deal with this. I had no idea. I asked for a book. There was no book. And struggled through. I didn't do it right. I'm not the mom who did it right. When the people that informed me of what I might be supposed to be doing didn't inform me of the right things I was supposed to be doing. And that included counselors that I went through the early years. It wasn't until this has really informed the disclosure occurred 40 years ago. So 41 years ago next month. And I've lived in the aftermath, and that has informed the decisions that I made along the way. My graduate program, I focused on child sexual abuse. I was in counseling with marriage and family emphasis, but I did my internship in a sexual abuse treatment program, which worked with sex offenders and families. Actually started my first Mothers of Sexually Abused Children group in my graduate program, and parent groups for adolescent offenders back then, way back in the early 90s. And so I've lived in this after getting my degree. Then 10 years ago, I completed my PhD, and I had started the MOSAC website during my PhD program. And that website contains, and that's over 10 years ago now, has 350 plus pages of information. So the book is a condensation of all the information, the most pertinent information that parents need to know when they have a disclosure of sexual abuse in their family. So I didn't have the information and support. I know that mothers desperately need it. And a mantra that sort of is a theme in the book is believe, support, and protect children. Always believe. Children almost never lie. They are telling the truth, and they need to be believed. They need to be heard, and we need to support them and protect them. So what do moms need after disclosure? One, they need general information about sexual abuse, but they also want information about their own child's sexual abuse. And they want to know more about what to do about after the disclosure, and what are the effects and consequences over time, and what about therapy? And they need coping skills. Their child needs coping skills. And then how do you parent a traumatized child? It's very different from parenting a child that hasn't been traumatized. There has to be a different approach. You have to be aware of PTSD symptoms. You have to be aware of triggers. You have to be aware that acting out isn't a clinical diagnosis, which many professionals might put on a child, not knowing that the source of the acting out is actually coming from the trauma itself. And they sometimes have to alter their entire lifestyles, because if it's a father figure in the home and the finances change, they might have to move out of their homes. They might have to change not just housing, but locations, and they have legal challenges, and they have to be able to get attorneys. There's so much that's involved in this. But what moms need most is respect. They need to be heard. They need to be listened to, they need to be understood, they need to be respected, and they need to be empowered in all of these different areas. There's so much that they need because they're responsible for being there for the child. I think the very best image I've ever come up with was when you're on a plane and they drop down the screen in front of you about how to put your oxygen mask on. They ask you, people, I've used this forever, and examples that, people would ordinarily think, well, you put the oxygen mask on the child first. No, you put the oxygen mask on yourself first so you don't pass out. And then you put the oxygen mask on your child. And it's the same principle here. The mother has to be healthy and well. At least she needs to be struggling to be healthy and well and getting support and care for herself so that she can give that support and care to her child. A thing to always remember, this is for professionals, this is for victims, this is for family members. The perpetrator is the one that's responsible for the abuse. It's never the victim. It's never the mom. The perpetrator is 100% responsible for what happened, for what that choice that was made, he or she made, okay? Because the majority of sexual abuse is perpetrated by men, but there are female perpetrators. The majority of adolescent sexual abuse is perpetrated by boys, but there are female adolescent as well as childhood abusers. And we know a lot of the childhood abusers is acting out because they've been sexually abused themselves as well. So that perpetrator is who to blame, not the victim and no one else. A problem is the systemic response means that there's not really justice that's the outcome. Victim wants justice. They want, well, a lot of times they want justice. Some victims just want it to go away. They just want to forget about it. But later on, they want justice. But the systemic response is really the factors of judgments and stigmas really influence what happens from that point on. DHS or CPS, Child Protective Services investigation. There's so many judgments against mothers, so many long-term stigmas. I'll talk about that in a little bit, that influence outcomes, and it's not founded. The sexual abuse allegation is not founded. In my career path, I have been a parent custody evaluator. I've been a parent coordinator. I've been a mediator in the court. I've done DHS evaluations. I've done all kinds of evaluations, from criminal violence to working with sex offenders and other mental health evaluations. And I submit these to court. I had, for many, many years, I had regular the time that I spent in the court testifying, especially when I was doing parent custody evaluations. But I could send in an evaluation to the court, or more often, court would be more responsive to me if I was sitting in the witness stand, but like to DHS. And I would say there's clear evidence here in these many, many pages that there was sexual abuse in the home. But it takes so much. They want physical evidence. This is something I really want to say here. They want physical evidence, and yet physical evidence is so rare. It's less than 5%. Research shows that, because sexual abuse does not have to be violent, doesn't have to leave scars. It leaves emotional, psychological, invasive scars on the individual that's been sexually abused, but not necessarily physical. But the laws were changed during my career path. The laws were changed where doctors could no longer diagnose sexual abuse unless there was physical evidence. And then law enforcement very often responds from the perspective of this might be a domestic dispute, or there might be a custody case, and they just really diminish the importance of the report. And many times it doesn't get forwarded to the district attorney's office, or there's no charges coming forward. So custody, court response, and then complicating factors are always whether there's domestic violence and whether there's addictions in the home as well. So really, what do parents need to know? How can we give support to mothers? What do professionals need to know? And how can professionals really understand and align with the mother or with the family and have some understanding of what's going on? Because it's like there's two different cultures, two ways of seeing and perceiving, two ways of thinking about this, two different worlds without really a connection there. Neither side knows how the other side really thinks, and people are in roles, professionals in a role, and then there's the role of the victim, and that's a really, I prefer the role of the term survivor. Actually, I like the term thriver, where you get past that, but that's a path you have to follow to get through that emotional processing and to get to a healing and recovery place. But they're unaware of the differences in the perception of and experience of the others. And also people insulate themselves against the pain, and that is professionals as well. Not wanting to really be fully there and present and experience the pain of this other person. And the same thing goes for the family members. They don't really want to know everything, all of the details. They just know it. It's more like it's a concept than it's the experiencing the horror. A lot of times the mothers do experience the horror. I haven't spoken, sure, in my career, I've spoken to mothers that were non-protective mothers. Yes, because I've run groups for mothers of sexual abuse actually in the beginning of my career, I knew mothers that were not necessarily horrified. However, the majority of mothers are horrified. They want to protect. The majority of mothers didn't know. They want to protect. They want to do the right thing. And they're horrified by what happened to their child. And the difference between that and the concept is that there's a lot of discussion about sexual abuse. It's in the papers, it's in the news, it's on movies, and it's like a concept. You don't really get the horror of it unless you know or have experienced or know somebody who's experienced it. So the problem in the approaches between professionals and the family, especially mothers who I work the most with, is that lots of times professionals view mothers as guilty. It's called mother blaming. It was around in the 80s. It was around in the 90s. It was around when I was doing my doctoral dissertation and had a lot of citations on mother blaming. It was around when I went back and did a really in-depth literature review in 2018, still articles coming up on mother blaming. It's still alive and well. And then from the mother's perspective, they think that professionals don't get it. They feel misunderstood. They are angry. And they don't feel heard. So this is a quote by Dr. Patricia Deegan. It says, our challenge, this is for professionals working with patients or working with clients. Our challenge is to be bold and brave and daring enough to remain human-hearted while working in the human services, to really feel with that other person and experience as a listener what that person and align with that person in their suffering. This is a quote from Brown, 1998. This was included in my dissertation. I think in the frontispiece, it was included in the front of the book that we just published. For me to be able to heal, to recover from my secondary abuse as the non-abusing parent, I do not need to be victimized or rescued, nor do I need to be punished for what happened to my children. Like most non-abusing parents, I've already crucified myself with feelings of guilt for what my children experienced. I do not need to run the gauntlet of suspicion and mistrust or endure aloofness and indifference. And that happens so frequently. So how do we cross that cultural boundary between mothers and professionals? Well, we have to listen. We have to have conversations. We have a dialogue. And the reason we listen is to understand. I work with couples almost on a daily basis in my office. They do a lot of family therapy. And we listen for the purpose of understanding, meaning we listen to be able to get what the other person's thinking, what the other person's feeling. We don't listen for the purpose of arguing with them or to change their mind, but we're listening to understand so that we're not trying to disconnect from them. We're trying to connect with them. And we listen with empathy. We try to tune into their thoughts and feelings so that people feel understood and not judged. Dr. Lisa Dixon, again, working in the mental health field, said, I didn't get it until I listened to my patients. This is a powerful statement because listening isn't just hearing, it's truly getting what the patient is saying. So we need to listen to the story, connect with the storyteller, leave behind all assumptions and judgments and just hear the need, be fully present to get what the thoughts, feelings, and struggles are in that person, listen for specifics, asking questions for details and clarifying questions as well, and paying attention to the feelings, the fear, the anxiety, and the pain. We need to validate, and we need to remember listening is helping. Just listening is helping. Just saying, I hear you actually helps. Elie Wiesel, who was the author of Night and a Holocaust survivor, and I've read a lot of his works, just as despair can come to one only from other human beings, hope too can only be given by other human beings. And that's our role when we're, as professionals, working with those who are suffering. So from Mel's perspective, sort of 41 years into this almost, nothing much has changed. Okay, child victims are still not believed. Their statements and preferences are minimized or ignored. And I'll speak to that a little bit later. Children are labeled with, oppositional defiance. They're labeled with ADHD, not with PTSD. They act out and it's automatically the child, not the home environment that's studied or evaluated. Mothers are blamed. Stories of mothers and children are found to be believable, not believable. How could a child say these things? Why does a mother say that their mother, they're unbelievable because they're painful, they're difficult, they're horrible. Horror is just a really good word for it. And there's a continued lack of effective response. Mothers continue to be vilified, accused of coaching, or considered complicit to the abuse, meaning co-abusers, if it's a father figure in the home, which there are a lot of, they're coing basically the abuse because somehow they had to have known, somehow they should have known, somehow maybe they did know and they didn't protect. So there's minimal understanding, minimal support from mothers. How do I also know this hasn't changed much? Because I listen to moms all the time. MOSAC emails, and MOSAC has the website, and we have a chat page. And I've had a MOSAC Facebook up since early 2011, I think January, February, Twitter account up since the same time. And so I get messages all the time. And on the chat page, moms say the same things I've heard for years. They're misunderstood. It's not working. They're not getting the help they need. It's not being charged. The person's going free after being arrested and nothing's happening. They were charged. They did go to court, but they didn't have to go to jail. So there's still like an ongoing threat to the family. I hear in the custody cases, and I'll speak to that in a bit as well. And so the news media also gives a very mixed message when it comes to child abuse. And we know that we have, I know that we have, and I think most people should know that we have a pornography epidemic in the United States that goes all the way down to Patrick Carnes. I went to a conference with him probably a good 10 years ago, I think, might be less than 10 years, but it's somewhere in that range. And he was talking, he's like the guru of sex offending, sexual addiction. He's written multiple books on sexual addiction. Okay. And when it comes to pornography, he said, now at that point, he said the starting age average was back to 10 years old for pornography. And there's so much child porn out there too. I've had a sex offender before tell me very early in my career that everything that he learned and that he went forward and actually perpetrated, he learned from pornography. And so we have these documentaries that have come out in just the last couple of years that are powerful sort of illustrations of how poorly reports of sexual abuse and the response and the outcomes are. I think the Michael Jackson HBO documentary on Neverland, or the Neverland one on Michael Jackson, was very powerful. And then Oprah Winfrey followed through with an interview special with the two young men who I think they were then in their 30s that had been sexually abused by Michael Jackson and their mothers. And it was that was a very powerful special as well. But did he get prosecuted? No. Did people believe it? No. After Neverland, there was a little bit of a belief and horror, but then then people stopped listening to music. Then they went back to listening to his music because they just couldn't believe somebody like him could have done all of those things. And then I'll never forget the New York Times article that I was shown that I saw right after Neverland came out, that actually called the mothers of the children complicit. They didn't know. Nobody thought he was doing these things. It was just this wonderful place for their kids to go with other kids, and they weren't aware that this was going on. However, they were called complicit in the sexual abuse of their sons, which is a term that no mother ever wants to hear applied to themselves. And then there's right now there's a 4-part Mia Farrow documentary on HBO right now about Woody Allen. And that's also very powerful, especially the last of the 4. If you want to watch that, it's so good. It gives so much information about how really poorly the whole thing, actually the child wasn't believed by a lot of people, and Woody Allen denied it. And the district attorney actually had plenty of evidence and could have gone forward and chose not to go forward because he didn't want Dylan to have to be in court and go through that court process. However, the effects of that have had such a destructive effect on that family. And it wasn't in 2014, she did come out as an adult. She wasn't listened to. 2018, she was listened to. And then a lot of the, Hollywood characters did really get it and come out against Woody Allen. And actually he wasn't allowed to do his next film in the United States. And then at the heart of gold, Larry Nassar, hundreds of victims in the Olympics, and in his work in a university as, the doctor for the coach, the doctor that was taking care of the athletes in his sexual abuse, except that one turned out well. Some of those victims had been saying out loud 20 years, reporting it 20 years. And it wasn't until that final conviction, which was good. That's a great also HBO documentary, that he received more than 100 years. I think it was something like 114. I don't remember the exact number of years in the conviction. The judge really came down on him because there was so much evidence. So this just speaks to the effect of status, the effect of public opinion, the effect of how the general public looks at sexual abuse. It's minimized, it's marginalized, it's ignored. So I want to move on to maternal belief. When a disclosure occurs, what does the mother or what does the father or what do family members do? No matter who the perpetrator is, it doesn't matter if it's your husband or your son or your brother, who. Belief is the most important gift you give your child. Just to say, I believe you. Just to say, I believe you is powerful, and it's not your fault and you're not to blame. It's very important. Now I've included here guidelines for disclosure process. However, for folks that have already gone through this, and they probably didn't know how to respond. And I try to, I talk about this and being calm and quiet and accepting and keeping your focus and attention on the child and saying, I believe you, and comforting the child and taking the disclosure seriously, telling the child you're going to report, telling the child that you're going to get them help. Remember, you're just really being there for your child. People don't have access to this information generally before their child discloses. If they go by this book, MOSAC book, it's after. And I had a mother just recently say to me, well, when are you going to write another book? When are you going to write a book that tells mothers what to do when their child discloses? And in my own head, I was saying, who's going to buy that book? Nobody is going to go to the bookstore and find a book and buy a book that says what to do if your child discloses sexual abuse, because that's the hardest story for mothers. They don't want to ever hear that story, and they will imagine that will never happen to them. So they're not going to know in advance. But perhaps there's somebody in the listeners to this particular Lunch and Learn that will remember their guidelines. There are things that you can do that really help you and your child or the child that's talking to you be able to have the kind of disclosure that's meaningful to them. They will remember the moment they disclose for the rest of their life. They will remember the reactions of the person they disclosed to for the rest of their life. They will remember whether it was taken seriously or whether it was diminished or unheard. This will be profoundly impactful to a child. Actions to take immediately, obviously report. And it's better if the exam for the child takes place in a child abuse assessment center where the professionals are specialized in addressing this issue, and the doctors there are trained in working with children that have been sexually abused, or by a sexual assault response team member. It's less helpful when it's the local pediatrician, when it's the ER. You don't want the child to keep going through this over and over again, and that's why there are CAC, there are child abuse centers. But you want to alert the child's pediatrician, and you want to keep, very important, keep the daily functioning normal as possible for a child post-disclosure, no matter what their age. Just keep things rolling. It's going to be hard for you, but you have to, as mothers, as parents, would have to, and no matter who the perpetrator is, you're dealing with your emotions, but keeping things structured, keeping the routine going, keeping it consistent, stable, safe, psychological safety, as well as physical safety for the child. These are important to the child, and they get counseling. Get counseling for mothers, fathers need counseling, as well as the child. Adolescent victims need to be in counseling right away. Sometimes adolescents don't want to go to counseling. I tell parents they need to, unless they're too old for you to push them out the door or throw them in the car, they need to go. And even if they don't talk, I remember when my child disclosed and went to a psychologist and didn't talk about it, just sat there quiet, that the counseling episode was ended by the psychologist as, not effective. Sometimes you have to establish a relationship. You have to sit and play games. You have to just get a relationship going before you expect the child to open up and talk. It's very, very important for the child to have that connection with someone. It's also, I always tell mothers it's important, because if this goes to court, a therapist talking about, especially if it's a family member, even if there's no physical evidence, it's an allegation or disclosure brought forward by a child, that therapist hearing it has to report. If anything else happens, that therapist has to report, and that therapist can be put on the stand. Mothers aren't believed on the stand. Mothers know they're not believed on the stand, but professionals are. So those are important things to think about. Why believe the child? This is an important question. Well, it's because children almost never lie. Why would a child lie about this? People think children make up stories. They really don't make up stories like this, okay? Sex offenders almost always lie. I have worked with sex offenders since the early 90s. They almost always lie. Why? They lie. It's pathological lying. They lie because it covers and protects, covers what they're doing, and it sort of wraps around, sort of the way deception or lying or denial wraps around any kind of an addiction. It wraps around this, protects them from getting the consequences of their actions. Children also almost always minimize when they do. They tell pieces of their story. It's minimized. They tell parts. They don't tell it all, which is why it's very interesting when these studies have come out where they're talking to prisoners who are sex offenders, and they're convicted and they're willing to talk about it. And if they tell a story and like the reporter, the person that's hearing their story knows that the story as it was told by the child, the story that's told by the perpetrator is usually much more real and much more horrific than the child has recounted because of dissociation, because the child can put it out of their conscious awareness, because when dissociation occurs, those memories aren't necessarily encoded into the hippocampus. There are all kinds of reasons why, dissociation becomes a coping strategy for many, many people who have experienced trauma as children. But minimizing the horror is a natural phenomenon. It's not something that's surprising. We would consider that normal. But the lack of belief in children's reports has caused incomprehensible pain. So The other thing is that the mother believing, and ambivalence, which is on the next couple of slides, maternal belief, ambivalence is one of the things that, so if there's a report for child sexual abuse made to like Child Protective Services, the mother is going to be under a microscope, going to be judged too. How effective she is in mothers. How did she respond as a mother? How did she respond? It's not taken into account that she's in the first stage of grief, which means that she's in a place of really working through the shock and the denial and the numbness of it, as well as dissociation, just like the child. That dissociation to trauma is a normal biologically wired function of the brain. It's an automatic response to trauma when it disrupts information processing, and there has to be a working through of that, and that can take place in therapy. But belief comes in stages, exactly like disclosure comes in stages. It's another thing I want to comment on. That disclosure, that first disclosure is really almost like a test to see how it's going to be received. And then there's other disclosures, and disclosures can go on for years. And the other thing to remember, if you've had one child that has disclosed sexual abuse and you have other children in the family, you need to be aware there is a probability that others have been abused as well. They might not come forward. They might even deny it if asked. Even if it is a father figure, the siblings, even siblings that have been abused, and one child actually discloses, can try to get that child to recant or turn back from that disclosure and say, oh, it wasn't true, I just made it up. That happens. So belief comes in stages as normal denial falls away and acceptance comes later. These are, just remember, these are normal responses. Ambivalence is normal, this back and forth, and it's a back and forth in feelings, there's a back and forth in the way we think about it. And professionals have to honor the complexities of what a mother is going through. And ambivalence has been written about a lot. I just opened up a book just recently. It was a book I've had on my shelf for several years. It was a very in-depth book about evaluating and assessing mothers of sexually abused children, a large book. And it was amazing what it said about ambivalence. I mean, that's a pathological, it's diagnosed, or not diagnosed, but it's symptomatic and judged as symptomatic of a non-protective mother to feel ambivalence at first, rather than this is a normal process, and you have to come to grips with the reality, and this takes a little bit of time, and you go back and forth in your head. As long as you're able to function and protect that child, that's the most important thing, as you process through the feelings as a parent, as a supportive caregiver to the child. We know that it's really not about the knowing or not knowing, or the believing or not believing, or the protecting or not protecting. We have to help the mother be able to feel supported, feel heard, get the coping skills, know what to do, how to manage this, and how to process through to health and recovery in the same way that the child victim or adolescent victim needs to process through to health and recovery. So they need support. So why moms don't know? Children don't tell. Children don't know how to tell. They don't know who to tell. They don't know what to tell. They don't even know they've been abused, because so many children actually don't understand that they've been abused. It's been normalized. It's not something painful and horrible. Maybe it's just a part. Maybe they've been told this is normal. Maybe they've been told that mom knows all about what's going on. Maybe that they've been threatened also, and they're very, very afraid. I'll go to jail, or your mom's gonna, go to jail, or I'm going to kill your dog. There's so many different ways that offenders threaten horribly children, horribly. And also the child's ashamed of what happened to them. And they feel guilty. They feel responsible. They're told by offenders that they're responsible, that it's because of them. It's their fault that this has happened. There's so many other reasons that children don't tell, and most children never tell. Mothers don't know. They don't have the education and the awareness about child abuse, and they also don't wear a lens. They don't have a lens in their eyes that sees sexual abuse when they see unusual behaviors in their child. And if you go through, like on the website or in the book, you can look at physical symptoms, emotional symptoms, behavioral symptoms to sexual abuse, and you can put the pieces together after you see the symptoms. However, if you don't think your child's been sexually abused, that's not even in your radar. You're not looking through a lens like that. You're not interpreting behaviors and emotions from that perspective at all. And abusers are very smart. They're highly skilled. They groom victims. They also groom mothers. They also groom families. Sometimes community members get very close to the families in which they abuse children. So whether it's familial or extrafamilial child abuse, grooming takes place. Abusers control victims, and often abusers control families as well. And that definitely happened if we look back at Michael Jackson. So what are some barriers to support for moms? This is also in the book, page 73. Often others cannot understand, cannot know the feelings, the horror, the grief that you are experiencing. As if someone in a safe home in central Kansas is trying to understand the feelings of someone standing on the Pacific coast in the middle of a recent tsunami and the destruction. Maybe they're out in a boat looking at their house partially submerged underwater. They've lost property. Maybe they've lost family members. They don't know where they are or whether they're still alive or not. And there is no way that person in central Kansas can wrap their mind around what that person in the middle of that tsunami is thinking or feeling. And that's the importance of trying to connect the best you can with victims and with the families. Other barriers to support. Well, when mothers most need support, they don't really want to seek it. They don't ask for it because they feel isolated. They feel alone. Secrecy completely surrounds sexual abuse. It's a silent epidemic. We don't talk about it very much. You certainly don't want to think that your next door neighbor is going through this or that you're going to be going through it next year. And after the code of secrecy is broken, then many times mothers are shunned, excluded, shamed. There's divisions. If it's familial abuse, there's almost always dispute and disruption and fractured relationships there, and sometimes causing serious estrangement among family members because they believe the perpetrator rather than the victim. And if the mother is trying to protect the child, she is severely criticized, and it just becomes a nightmare for an additional nightmare for the mother. While the mother's initial reactions are everything from shock, anger, rage, hatred, wanting to kill the offender, the perpetrator, to just depression, just wanting to hide out, and just wanting to die, in a state of despair. There's such a large range of emotions that mothers feel when this occurs. At the same time, and trust has been damaged, and the world doesn't feel safe. Some of these things are very similar if you look at it to similar, but obviously very different. When you look with the things that survivors also suffer with and have to get through, that range of emotions, the feeling the world's not safe, inability to trust, difficulty in establishing relationships. There's so many different after effects and consequences of being sexually abused that are similar to this. So I wanted to throw out some questions that mothers ask, because these are very real questions and they're disturbing questions. And you can sort of imagine what it would be like if you were a mother, and you could also imagine as a father what it would be like if you were going to be having to ask these questions. And these are all very real questions. What if the abuser is a sibling? There's a significant percentage of abuse that's perpetrated by siblings. And then you have this parenting situation where now your heart's literally divided. You have the child that's the perpetrator and the child that's the victim, and you're the mother to both or the father to both, and you have to support both. And unfortunately, I've seen way too many parents that ostracize and just don't want to have anything to do with the sibling that abused, and that sibling is also hurting and needs help. And what do I do if my adult child discloses and I didn't know? All those years I didn't know what was going on. There's a whole range of emotions and disruption in that relationship. What if more than one child was abused? What if there's evidence but no charges are filed? What do I do if the child says it, discloses it, and then recants and takes it back for all those reasons that children do recant? How do I manage the lack of support? How do I manage interference and non-support from friends and family members? What do I do when they say that my child's supposed to testify in court? What do I do if they're testifying in court with the perpetrator in the room? That's re-traumatization. How do I manage that? A lot of mothers don't want their child to go to court, and they're fine with the charges being reduced so that there's, so that there's a settlement pre-trial, so that their child doesn't have to sit in that courtroom because it's required. for the child to face the abuser, even if they're 2 years old, 3 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old, 6 years old. Little children have to face the person that has given them the most pain and tell the story in front of all of these people. Think about how horrifying that is. And especially if you're the parent of that child. What do I do if there's no counseling services available? Like right now, not much available out there for children, and it's often online and mask. And can you imagine a child that's like 4 or 5 years old wanting to talk to a therapist, or the parent wants them to talk, and they're online. They can't really be in a one-on-one with them, and if they are in a one-on-one, they have to be masked. What if I don't have family or friends to help me with the children, other children, to deal with the court hearings and the going to investigations and going to counseling with my child and going through this whole process? What about visitation with abusers, post-disclosure, post-court, when the child is ordered to have time with the perpetrator? That happens so frequently. How do I manage that? What are the guidelines for that? What if I don't have the money to stay where I am? I have to move. My child has to change schools. There are decisions to make, and I'm struggling with my own emotions. And what if my child blames me? What if my child is so angrier at me than they are at the perpetrator for me not protecting them, even though I tried my best to protect them, but I didn't know when it was happening. But afterwards, I did my best. And many, many mothers come from that perspective. I read it almost on a daily basis in the chat page, in other places, from moms' private messages, that they've tried their best to protect their child, and then their child later on accuses their mother of knowing, and then is very, very angry. So we're dealing with not a perfect storm, a very imperfect storm, okay? When it does go to court, the court is not really going to act in the best interest of the child. It's the evidence that's given. It's sometimes if it's a mother father against, it's going to be the evidence that's presented. It's going to be this tug of war between mother and father, the father denying, the mother saying it really happened. If it's a custody case, and it's a risk factor in a custody case, and a prediction of, or a report of sexual abuse, even if it wasn't adjudicated, is still a risk factor in a custody case. Do you want that child to be spending the night, spending weekends, spending half the time, or that person getting full custody of the child? That's going to impact the child for the rest of their lives. There's so many complicating factors. CPS not found in cases, the accusation of mothers coaching, that's a very, very common thing. Police response, charging process, prosecution by the district attorney's office. They don't want to prosecute somebody they don't think that guilty and they can get a conviction for. I've had those conversations with district attorneys in my career path, and they don't want to send an innocent man to jail. However, I cannot tell you how many millions of innocent children are then left in the homes to continue to be abused. And then there's the parental alienation defense. That's a nightmare, okay? And that started with Woody Allen's defense back in the 90s. And it spread like wildfire across the United States, where almost every day in every state across the country, that is used as a defense for fathers. When we're talking about this large number of fathers, father figures, biological fathers, our stepfathers, that use this as a defense in the courtroom. That it's something that's been made up by the mother. It's parental alienation. Won't let me see the child. This whole thing is about parental alienation, which is really a false syndrome. And many years ago, I looked at a national legal website, and they really advised against this ever being used in a courtroom, but it is used in a courtroom. It really has a hold in the court system. It's easier to blame a mother than to blame a father for being an abuser. Why is that? Well, because it's more believable that a mother could be hysterical or angry or upset than their father could be an abuser. So what are the results of this parental alienation syndrome? Okay, in 98% of cases when fathers claimed parental alienation, the family courts did not accept that the child abuse accusation was true. Women lose custody for alleging sexual abuse against fathers. That's really hard to believe, but it happens a lot. Every year, custody courts require an estimated 58,000 children to return to someone with unsupervised contact, someone who's been accused of abuse. 58,000 children that don't want to go there. 58,000 children that cry the night before or several days before they have to go for that visit. 58,000 children that beg not to have to go back. Okay. And the mother has to let them go back, because the consequences in a custody case of not letting them go back means that it goes back to a hearing, and it's very possible that the mother can lose custody and the entire custody goes over to the perpetrator of sexual abuse. And after being put back in custody of the abuser, 88% of children report more incidents of abuse. So I teach moms, and there's actually an organization called Mama Bears, but I talk to moms about being a mama bear. You're the protector. You're the one that's going to stand up there. You've got to be strong. You've got to be assertive. You've got to do what you've got to do. You've got to be strong on yourself and do what you've got to do to protect your child, no matter what, like a mama bear, like a grizzly bear. Okay. And you know what grizzly bears do to anybody that comes after the cubs? They're going to be torn apart piece by piece. But you have to be very wise in the way you do this, because you'll be judged in the systems by how you respond to the entire issue, the entire process after your child disclosed. So you want to protect your child, but you have all of these different complicating factors that keep you from being able to completely protect your child. There might be domestic violence. You might be with a narcissistic or a sociopathic partner. You might have been abused, okay? And which will affect you. There might be fears or threats. The victim might actually go back and recant. The victim might be attached to the abuser. That's the Stockholm syndrome. You can read about that, the bank in Stockholm, where the hostages actually aligned with the robbers. There's learned helplessness in both mom and victim when some of these things are there. They've tried to get out. They wanted to get out. Certainly, even prior to my going into my graduate program, I had a good friend who had her children were sexually abused. And she found out about it. She'd been within a domestic violence relationship for a long time. She tried to exit with her children. He broke out the windows of the car. She stayed a little bit longer. She was able to escape and went to a safe house, a women's safe house. And she told her story. The police came. They arrested her too. He went to prison. She went to jail for 6 months. They took her children away. And this was back in the 80s, okay, early 80s. Probably around 83, somewhere around there. I would hope that wouldn't happen now, but it did, because that mother blaming was so strong. And then she had to fight really hard to get her kids back. And there's betrayal trauma. It would be really useful for anybody that doesn't know about Dr. Jennifer Freyd to read about betrayal trauma theory. She's at the University of Oregon, has a lab there called the Dynamics Lab. And she has been studying betrayal trauma for many, many years. Her website has the abstracts from articles way back by year, as well as some complete articles. And she's written some really, really great stuff. It informed my thinking. I had many citations in my dissertation on it. I have loaned out probably hundreds of her books, the book that she wrote for survivors, which is actually called Blind to Betrayal. I would hold up a book, but I could hold up a book, but it's called Blind to Betrayal. It's where, and the underlying thing is the dissociation factor. And it's really, really useful in understanding why victims get attached to abusers, whether they're children or whether they're domestic violence victims in adulthood. And then, there's learned helplessness. You've tried to get out, you couldn't get out, you give up trying to get out. You tried to tell, nobody listened to you, you give up trying to tell. Okay, so there's no legal protection in many cases. And there's, if there is a custody agreement, it's violated. It can take months to get to a court hearing, and a very big issue is there's no money for mothers many times. Attorneys cost a lot of money. It can cost $3,000, $5,000, maybe that's low, $10,000, depending on where you are, to just pay the retainer fee for an attorney in a custody case. If it's the father figure that's the abuser, it can cost upwards of $100,000 to be able to get through that whole court process. Most mothers do not have that money. Mothers have no money for attorneys. They write me, they call me, what do I do? It's just not like free attorneys out there that are providing services for mothers of sexually abused children so that they can actually defend and protect their children. The worst case scenario, mothers very often have to face the reoccurring reality of the abuser having access to the child who has previously disclosed sexual abuse. This could be alternating weekends. It could be on a 50-50 parenting plan. It could be the worst of the worst case scenarios. Actually, the child's taken away from you as the mother and given to the abuser. And yes, this does happen. I put one slide on for adverse childhood experiences, simply just as a reminder that line that goes up to death. When children experience trauma in childhood, It disrupts their neurodevelopment as children. It develops, it disrupts the functioning of the amygdala, the emotional reaction center, the onset of anxiety and depression in childhood, PTSD symptoms, and then social, emotional, cognitive impairments. We go up into health risk behaviors, drug addiction, alcoholism, early use of substances, cutting, self-harm, suicidal ideation, eating disorders. There's so many things that are related to childhood abuse and trauma. And I used to call it, when I worked in abuse, alcohol and drug addiction centers for many years, and was an administrator and some, as well as a manager. And I would call it the engine that drives the train of addiction. And many people that work in an addiction field see that is the engine that drives addiction, is that trauma engine, the trauma childhood. When I work with individuals that have high levels of long-term, like heroin addiction or methamphetamine addiction, or sometimes late-stage chronic alcoholics, they've come from really horrific, sometimes 8 to 10, a lot of times 8 to 10 ACEs. So how do we engage with mothers of sexually abused children? Well, we have to get rid of the myths and follow some assumptions, like they really need your help and you need to listen. They've been groomed. They are perceived inaccurately. And if they are perceived as co-responsible, they're not going to react very well. That mother blaming issue is more likely if the perpetrator obviously is a father figure, and it assumes the mother has knowledge, enabled, and didn't protect. I went back and I looked, because I could remember from a book I read way back, reading about someone, I can't remember his name right now, but I could, if anybody asks me who the name is, I'll give them, I would be glad to give it to them at some later time. But it was written in 1980. It was an article in 1980. It said that the treatment focus post-disclosure should focus on the mother. And really, it's the mother's fault, because the father was reacting to the mother's weakness, because the mother was weak and didn't obviously supply his needs sexually, but also was just absent. I mean, all of these, don't blame the father, blame the mother, treat the mother. And that was the stereotype that was present back in the 80s, when the profile of mothers was really pretty horrific. They were looking at them having mental flaws and emotionally all kinds of negative things, rather than just keeping their focus on the offender. What is this person doing to this child? Why are they doing this? Get them help, get them out, okay, and try to support the mother in a protective stance. So these negative perceptions persist right to today, okay? The character flaws and the collusion with perpetrators, okay? So we need to get rid of the stereotypes and know that the majority of mothers do believe their children and they didn't know prior. So one of the most important things for healing and recovery for the mom and the child, and actually this is the goal, right? Post-disclosure is recovery, healing and recovery. That emotional processing is so important. Trauma therapy is so important. But for both mothers and survivors to learn positive coping skills, learning how to manage their thoughts and their feelings and their behaviors, and to have that self-awareness and self-understanding, self-insight that's necessary to go forward and not have the past impact their future, the acceptance of the reality of their lives, and getting rid of all that denial of reality, and really facing what the truth is about the past, and the truth is about what they've experienced. And then in that moment, choosing to go forward into a healthy lifestyle, using Marshall Linehan's mantra, because I've taught DBT for years and years, since 1995, is building a life worth living, building a life. Mothers and families have to rebuild their lives post-disclosure. Victims have to become survivors and rebuild their lives and go on to become healthy and whole. But there is ongoing pain and hurt. Mothers will watch their children for the rest of their lives and watch those effects and consequences of that childhood sexual abuse. They have to let go of the anger and the hatred that they feel, because that's just self-destructive, actually self-harmful, and cope with the fear and anxiety, okay? There's treatment challenges for mothers, and there's a long list of those. One of the things I want to focus on, or at least mention, is the medical part, making sure that mothers go to a doctor, and their primary care physician's aware of what they're going through. because the possibility or probability of somatic or physical symptoms post-disclosure is very, very high, as it is those somatic symptoms that occur in children, stomach aches, headaches, undisclosed, undiagnosable pains, non-organic illnesses that occur where they're even hospitalized, they're coming out of the sexual abuse that occurred to them, and for the mothers out of the trauma of what they're going through with their child. Very, very common in my dissertation. There was a significant number of severe somatic effects, even post 5-10 years after the disclosure was, I think it was 47 something percent was still in the severe category of somatic symptoms. Why was I really interested in studying post-disclosure? Dissociation, yes. PTSD, yes, but somatic symptoms, because I did. I was a very, very healthy mother, very, very healthy woman, hadn't been sick for years. Post-disclosure, I had a ruptured appendix with peritonitis, nearly died. Then I got pneumonia. Then I had gallbladder surgery. I had all this stuff right within that year or two immediately after. IBS, irritable bowel syndrome. It's a lot of self-disclosure here, but it's a fact because this is what happens. So I gave the PHQ-5. I think that was the measure that I used in the dissertation to look at the medical effects. It's very, very important for professionals to be aware of how is this mother taking care of herself? Is she emotionally processing what's going on in her life? Is she getting coping skills? Is she getting exercise? Is she eating right? Is she getting sleep? Is she taking care of herself medically, going to the doctor, taking care of herself? Because if she doesn't take care of herself, she's not going to be able to take care of the child. A mother getting sick when her child's needs her support is not a good outcome at all. There's also this thing called a parent competence. I use that phrase a lot in the addiction field with addicts that go to treatment and they look like they're just fine. They have all the right answers. They seem really competent and capable and aware and articulate, but they're really not. We've got to look under that apparent competence. And it's not competence per that they're not being good mothers, but you need to be aware of they're really experiencing all of this pain, all this suffering. We need to get rid of the mother blaming, the judgment. We need to look at the betrayal bonds. We need to look at the real life responsibilities and the financial issues that mothers do address. Treatment challenges for families. The biggest one that I've got on this list is siblings, two big ones, siblings. And what happens if families have more than one child that's been abused, or one of the siblings is an abuser? How do you manage that? We have a lot in the book that is written about that very thing. Okay, many sections include things about siblings. Siblings need to be included in the process post-disclosure. They need to know what's going on. They need to be supported and understand they have very strong feelings about this as well. They're suffering as well. And then there's a reconciliation or reunification. So if the abuser is a father figure, the court is going to press for reunification of the family, reunification of the father with the child, even post-prison in many states. And that's very destructive, obviously, to the abuser. It's not destructive to the abuser, it's destructive to the victim. And the treatment challenges for child victims, just knowing, it's like brainwashing. It's like they've been groomed and they've been told this all the time that they were abused, and the secrets that they hold and the identity of the perpetrator makes a big difference. They're going through grief, post-trauma, dissociation might be at play, helpless and powerlessness definitely was there. And the whole conversation around recanting and negative attitudes towards the mom, the primary supporter. So often there is that disruption in the relationship with the mom for the child's perception of non-support. And I talk to parents of adult children who have those disclosures, and it comes back, and rather than be defensive, be really open with the child, and listen to the child and not defend yourself, because the child's perceptions are the child's perceptions. They're coming from memories they have as a child, and they didn't feel heard, they didn't feel protected. So just be there and be present. And then parenting traumatized children, again, is very, very different from parenting children who have been traumatized. We need to see the child through a trauma lens and be aware of triggers, be aware of post-trauma symptoms. We need to empower children that have learned have experienced the helplessness and the powerlessness of being an abuse victim. We need to empower the child by giving them more choices and really teaching them resilience as well. And there's pieces on the website and in the book about teaching resilience. And we need to be advocates for our child at all times. I want to make sure I mentioned effects of culture, because obviously cultures have different beliefs, different norms, different values around sexual abuse. And we need to be very aware of that when we're working with families from different cultures than ours, and be able to hold that awareness of their expectations, their biases, and where they're coming from. That's that understanding piece. I put in here tips for professionals, which include a lot of what I've already talked about. I don't think anything's new on this page. They're listening as the biggest, maintaining and focusing attention, making a connection, and tips for mothers. Right at the top, taking care of yourself and finding a trustworthy therapist who listens to you, and then creating a safe support system, because so many mothers have no support or minimal support. So that's so important. And then accepting your anger without blaming yourself. So these are, and then just being patient. It does get better with time. And on the very last slide, I do put a link into the book that was published just recently in February, which is available on paperback and ebook. So that's the end of what I was going to share. I sort of ran through it very, very quickly, very, very quickly. I don't even know if I used my full 45 minutes. I don't know if I went over. I don't know. I didn't have a timer. So I don't know where we're at with that. So help me out, somebody. Rachel, are you there?
Hi, Dr. Mel. Thank you so much for this amazing presentation. I know I've learned a lot, and thank you for your expertise. It was just so good to hear from your point of view, how we can continue to support survivors and how parents can support survivors. I know we had a couple of questions that came in, if that's all right. Okay, so I just want to pull this up really quick in the chat. So do you have any thoughts on ages when children should seek therapy if they were abused? Like, I guess kind of what is a good age for therapy is the question that's being asked.
As young as possible. A lot of therapists won't see a child when they're very, very young. But if a child's like 4, 5, 6, has good verbal skills, and play therapy obviously is the best choice. Finding a child therapist that also has expertise in sexual abuse and is able to do play therapy with the child, get the child to open up through sand therapy, sand play, all kinds of different ways and art therapy is powerful. As well with children, just having them draw pictures, that's powerful, because they will draw everything if you just let them. They will like put their hearts on that piece of paper, put the truth on a piece of paper. Young, yes, but a lot of therapists won't see children that young. A lot of mental health agencies won't see children that young. So you have to really look around for a therapist all the way through. And sometimes the abuse has been severe, it's been long-term or chronic, and children might need to be in therapy for years, because the longer and more impactful it is and the closer the relationship with it is, this is going to be carried forward in their life and affect so many areas of their life. So the positive relationship with a therapist is crucial.
Wonderful. Another question we have, and also for everyone who's listening, if you have any additional questions, definitely feel free to throw those in the chat as well. Another question we had was, what is the most important part of a child's recovery from abuse? So I guess the most important part of kind of the process of healing as a child survivor.
There's so many things that are important. The most important part, obviously, is protecting them for further abuse. I'm going to say that, protecting them so that they're not abused again. But secondarily, to provide a secure and safe home environment as possible, so they feel loved, protected, heard, comforted, and their needs are met, so that they are actually in an environment where they can heal, where they go out from that environment to get counseling. They go out from that environment to interact with the world.
The next question is about step parents who might be perpetrators. So kind of asking, do you have any specific information for dealing with children who were abused by step parents?
It's the same as whether it's a biologic parent. It's still a figure, a father figure, mother figure, whether they're foster or they're biologic or they're step. It's easier to extract yourself from a step parent. If, let's say, stepfather is the abuser, it's easier to extract yourself because the court system doesn't look at that in the same way. And so you really can cut off the risk of further abuse at that point. I didn't really address that whole issue of sometimes with adult children as well as with young children. Obviously, you've got to put aside your own relationships. And even if you have been with your spouse for years, the child has to come first. The protection of the child has to come first, and recognize that yes, that relationship with a stepfather can be every bit as close as it is, or a stepmother, as it would be with the biological parent, simply because there's that day-to-day contact and there's that trust that's been violated. It's a betrayal of the trust. So the dynamics are the same. That would be the response I would give. Really the dynamics are the same as if it was a biological parent.
And then are there any specific organizations that someone can seek out when they find that their child is being abused?
I'm not going to give you a list, but I will say that the MOSAC.net, the website has, I don't know, probably hundreds of organizations. I don't know, there are different pages that give resources of organizations, many that have 24/7 hotlines on the website, as well as in the book. We've listed the hotline numbers for every state for child sexual abuse, who to call, where to get support, where counseling services are available. So there's a large resource section in the back of the book. What do I do now? And there's also a lot of resources on the website. So I couldn't possibly just start, giving a lot of names out. There's so many. There are resources out there. I know that sometimes I mention like Bikers Against Child Abuse, right? And some of the mothers that I talk with that are on the chat page, have accessed them and found them to be very, very helpful because they show up and support the child in court. And so there's just a lot of different resources if mothers just knew about those resources, or others just knew about those resources that are available.
Definitely. And then this is a question actually that I have for you. I'm going to drop your website link in the chat, mosac.net, for anyone who wants to check out Mel's amazing website. And Mel, just kind of going forward, is there any ways that people can get involved with MOSAC? Any ways that we can contact you, after the Lunch and Learn, I guess, what feels best for you in that way? And also, I put your website in the chat. That might be the best way, but just wanted to highlight if there were any other ways that we could stay in touch and support your work.
You can throw my email on there, mel@mellangston.com. And that's really where my email comes in from MOSAC. So if anybody contacted me through MOSAC, there's a contact me on MOSAC, which goes directly into mel@mellangston.com. I prefer not phone calls, although I do receive phone calls because I'm actually quicker to respond to emails than I am to phone calls. My phone call log gets very large. So, and I would be glad to assist anyone. And then going to the website, looking at resources, or, getting the survival guide and being able to have that how to do, what to do after disclosure there, if you're a professional, to be able to recommend that to clients that come into your office. That's really important, just so they'll know. That's why it's written. It's written to be a resource that can be given out. For years, professionals would sometimes write me, and they don't do that anymore. They just do it. I know. Just, can we print off stuff from the website? Of course you can print off stuff from the website. Use it whenever you want to. Use it in your groups, or use it in classes. Use it with your clients, because that's why it's there. It's like, it's not copyrighted. It's there. I want it to be used to help protect kids. I hope I answered your question, but I think I went a little bit over what you asked me. So go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mel. So again, the website is in the chat, and so is Mel's email, mel@mellangston.com, excuse me. Thank you so much for being here today, Mel. It was so informative. This PowerPoint is amazing, and thank you for speaking to this issue and how to support survivors, especially from a parent perspective and a service provider's perspective.